I'm Sadie Tillery. I'm the Director of Programming at Full Frame, and we have an amazing assortment of editors here attending the festival, and 4 very talented individuals who are going to speak about their craft this morning. Sam Pollard is going to be moderating the conversation, and I believe that you all have bios for each of the other editors. I should just mention that Toby Shimon is listed on the panelist sheet, and unfortunately she was unable to attend, but Penny Falk has graciously volunteered to participate in her place. So thanks again for being here, and thanks, Sam.
Good morning, everyone. Just glad to be here, glad to be on this panel with all my esteemed colleagues. I'm going to introduce each one very briefly, and then I'm going to get into some questions about the editing process of documentary features. On my right here is Amy Linton, who has been editing dozens of documentaries, feature films, and music videos for 25 years. Some of her credits include Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, Clint Eastwood's Emmy-nominated documentary, Johnny Mercer, The Dreams on Me, and the film that she has here called A.K.A. Doc Pomus, which is playing this afternoon, right? She's worked on that film with Peter Miller, who she also edited The Internationale, Sacco and Vanzetti, and Jews in Baseball. At the far end, I have Penny Falk, another esteemed colleague of mine, who has a film here playing today too called Maidentrip. But she has edited a number of impressive documentaries over the years, from Toots, and which directed by Christy Jacobson, Election Day, Kathy Shagivny, and the wonderful, wonderful, fascinating film Joan Rivers, A Piece of Work. And finally, in the middle, Matthew Hamachek, who began his career working on the Oscar-nominated documentary Street Fight with Marshall Curry, and has went on to collaborate with Curry on Racing Dreams and If a Tree Falls, which was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary. His latest film, which was the opening night film, is Gideon's Army, which was directed by Dawn Porter. Let's give all these editors a hand. Now, when thinking about the panel last night, you know, as an editor, I like to try to do my homework. And one of the questions, you know, when I'm editing, a question is always asked of me, because I edit also dramatic films. Which do I prefer, editing dramatic films or documentaries? And my answer is always documentaries. I've always, over the years, preferred editing documentaries because I was taught a long time ago that the editor of the documentary has a real strong role in creating the story, creating the structure, creating the arc of the film. And it can be, you know, for us editors, it can be a tremendous sort of responsibility. You know, you can fail or you can succeed, and you never know when you're working with documentary footage. And it's to me, it's a thing that I always treasure, this notion of being challenged by documentary footage and trying to figure out how to tell a story. So one of the first questions I have to my esteemed colleagues here is, working on feature-length docs, you're always confronted nowadays, because everybody shoots video, with lots and lots of footage, hours and hours of material. I'm curious, and each one of you can, you know, pick up on this, is how do you initially approach, you know, looking at all this material when you start editing? Penny?
I like to watch everything. I like to know as little about it as possible, because I know my first reaction to the material would be my freshest. I often get bored really quickly, like on the Joan Rivers job. She's really funny, but after you've heard the same joke like 10 times, it's just not funny anymore. So I watch it, and I pay attention to my emotional response to the footage. I take notes on what I'm feeling when, and that's always my first step, watching everything and feeling it.
Matt?
I think that's pretty much right. I think a lot of it depends on the director and the time constraints that you have when you're working on a film. If you have, just try to, for example, on both Gideon's Army and one of the other films that Sam mentioned, Racing Dreams, we had 500 hours of footage. So if you try to break that down into 8-hour days, you're talking about 3 months of just watching footage. And a film has to have a considerable amount of time to edit if you're going to be able to have 3 months before you even make a single cut. So on Racing Dreams, we actually had the time to do that. So we watched it, and as we were going, we would start to just whittle the most obvious things down until we got to a 50-hour cut. And then we would take that, get that down to 10, and then eventually get down to 3. And that's when we would actually start to try to shape a film. Because until then, I mean, when you're looking at even 50 hours, you really have no sense of what it's going to end up being. So.
Let me ask this question of everyone. Do you screen by yourself? Do you screen with the director? I mean, in my experience, I screen by myself normally. And when you screen, do you start to sort of write down things you like in terms of selects? Or do you just screen and then go back and screen again? Amy?
Well, we usually have everything transcribed, and so then with the transcripts I go through, and Peter, my director I've worked with since, I guess, 2000, since he was at the interviews, you know, he has already kind of known what the best parts are, and he starts selecting, and then we go through it, and like Matthew was saying, I string out, you know, just sort of an assembly of all the best stuff. And but yeah, back when we used to shoot the films that I worked on with you, we'd watch everything, but now it's kind of tough to get through it all. So
I want to jump on, this is interesting to me, because a lot of people start with super long cuts, 10-hour cuts, and whittle down. I've never had a cut over 2 hours. I'm the opposite. I'm small and get bigger. I do think, and I know editors who work both, you can go either way, so just for the record.
Let me ask this other question. When you do screen and select, how do you approach vérité? I know transcripts, I also do that with interviews, but how do you approach selecting vérité, Matt?
Well, with vérité, I feel like you start to actually cut a very long version of the scene. I mean, this is what I do, is I take, if, let's just take, for example, a family is sitting around a dinner table and they're having dinner over the course of 3 hours, and you know in the end the scene is probably going to be 90 seconds or something around there. And what I do is I always try to create a 10-minute version of the scene or something like that, something around there, where I just take everything that I love and I try to still make some kind of an arc for the scene where people are sitting down, one conversation happens, it leads to another, and then eventually it ends. Even though you know that there's no way it's going to be that long, you just still try to make a beginning and middle and an end for each scene so that you can kind of just see how it's working in that state. Yeah.
That's what you do also, Penn?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's true about the beginning, middle, and end. Also, and people can disagree with me on this. I'd like to know what you guys think. I feel like a scene can be about one thing, and so when I'm cutting a scene, I know what I want the scene to be about, and anything that's not about that, I'm not putting into the scene. I don't know if you guys do approach it the same way or not. So.
Do you approach it that way, Amy? I tend to, when I have lots of footage, like when I worked on this Obama documentary, we had so much vérité footage, like 1,000 hours. I tend to do what you do, man. I look at the dailies of a scene, and I start to just sort of crunch it down in terms of how it was done chronologically. So if I have like 40 minutes of dailies, I try to get it, my brain says, try to get it to a 15-minute assembly, knowing full well that it's going to get tighter and tighter. You know, so I always sort of approach it that way. But I like this term all of you both use, beginning, middle, and end. Now, what does that mean after you started to edit the material? You look at the beginning, middle, and end that you originally had. What happens usually in the process, Matt?
Oh gosh, I mean, everything completely changes. I think one of the things that, just in terms of beginning, middle, and end, that I've always liked to think about is that I think that's a lot of what we do as editors, and one of the things that I always focus on multiple levels. Each shot has a beginning, middle, and end. Each scene, each act, the entire film, and I really like to focus on that as I'm editing at different stages, and I think it has like a pacing to it that's really important to me, and that obviously changes over time. And one of the interesting things with Gideon in particular, the film that opened here, was that while we had 500 hours in the end, I think when I came on, of the footage that's actually in the movie, only 50% of it was shot. So it was a completely different experience for me as an editor, because one of our characters hadn't even started allowing us to film him yet. And so it really gave me an interesting opportunity, which was to say, this is a really interesting question. Why don't you ask him this question and see how, see what the answer is? And we rarely have that opportunity, because most of the time we're hired after somebody has been working on a film for 2 years at some points, and it was actually wonderful. and really being able to look at the footage as it came in and say, you know, I heard him say something off camera when I heard it on his mic, but we never actually talked to him about it, and never actually had like a real conversation about it. Do you think the next time you can ask him about this thing that I heard about, and then it would end up being a scene later in the movie? And so it was a very interesting way of going about the process.
Interesting, good. I have another question. I mean, you know, Penny, when I saw the Joan Rivers film, which I really liked a lot, my question as an editor was, how did you come up with the structure? Now, every editor has a different approach to how a structure is sort of figured out. I mean, sometimes what I tend to do is, before I start a project, like when I worked on When the Levees Broke with Spike, I would get these 3x4 cards. I would write down all the scenes, and I'd get a big board, and I sort of organize it that way. And then I'd say, well, okay, and I'd build my cut with those cards. How did you figure out that structure in the Joan Rivers film?
It took lots of cards all over the room. I had no clue what the structure was. I cut it by, if people have seen I cut it by storyline, and I didn't even worry about intercutting it. I'm like, okay, let's do this by storyline. And then you just start putting it together to see what makes sense. Like okay, first you have to introduce the character, and you have to set up the conflict, and you have to know who she is, and things like logically make sense as you go along. We pretended it was chronology, but it's not chronology. Everyone lies in documentaries, you guys know this, right? The chronology is never what they say it is. Except, and I'm going to jump into to say Maidentrip, the film that's showing today about the girl who sailed around the world. She's 14 to 16, and I love cheating. It makes me happy. I couldn't do it in this film because she physically changes, so I couldn't take her when she's 17 and pretend she was 14. But I'm not trying not to answer the question. It really is, I cut this sections and then just kind of see what made sense. I know that's such an awful answer. Amy?
Well, I usually do historical documentaries and not vérité, so that, in a way, that's easier because you can kind of script it. And but yeah, when you were talking about the beginning, middle, and end, I was just thinking about how that's always the last thing that I cut because you just never. It's the hardest thing to introduce a film and to try and make people, you know, want to stick with it. Like, why should I spend 2 hours of my time watching this film? So, you know, you have to come up with something that's going to grab people, and then you can go in to start telling the story. And then the ending, a lot of times I get stuck with having 3 or 4 endings, and it's really, that's one of the second hardest thing is ending the film. So.
Matt, how did you approach the structure if a tree falls?
Well, we knew the film is about, and it's an interesting structure because basically we not only follow a guy who grows up in a working class neighborhood in Queens, who goes out west and becomes involved in environmental extremism, and then eventually joins this group called the ELF, and then they basically burn down buildings of companies that they feel are not doing great things to the environment. And so we had to follow his arc, the actual group's arc as it developed from a peaceful group into an extreme group, and then a couple of the different histories of towns, and it's very complicated when you're trying to juggle all the different story arcs of those things. So what we do, and I think this applies also to other films I've worked on when you have multiple characters, is we basically take sequences and we make the arc just for the guy who starts in Queens and then goes to here, and we just string that out as its own arc. And then we take the movement of the ELF and we string it out as its own thing. And until those things are all working, we don't try to have them bounce off of each other, because those things then have to be built separately, like how each scene comes out of each other. You want to have some kind of connective tissue that makes you feel as if you're not just jumping into a new story. It should feel more seamless. And I mean, If a Tree Falls in particular was very difficult for that reason. But yeah.
How long was the edit?
Each of the last 3 films I've worked on, the ones that I've just been talking about, were 1.5 year long edits. So and really the only way, I can't imagine, you really do have to have, I know some people think that you only have to have 6 months and sometimes even less to do it, but the amount of time, whenever people call me and ask me, how long does this really take? And no director wants to hear, or producer wants to hear this answer, but a year and a half to tell a vérité story is really the appropriate amount of time, in my opinion. So.
And Amy, how long did A.K.A. Doc Pomus take?
It took a little over a year as far as the editing, and as far as structure, since it's about a songwriter, I structured the film really around the songs. I used the songs to tell his story, and I really cut every scene, you know, just totally integrated with the songs. And so that's why whenever there's any kind of revision, it was sort of like a kind of playing Jenga with the film. It's like you pull this out because the lyrics would come up at a certain point, and you know, just I'd had to completely recut the music. So, but I used the music a lot to dictate the structure of the film.
How long did Maidentrip take, Penny?
That was actually the fastest edit I've ever had, because, you know, it's just a girl on a boat. It took me, no, I mean, it took me 6 months, but normally I'm in the 10 to 14 month, what these people are saying. And it's true, people don't want, producers never want to hear that, but.
What does that mean in terms of budget implications? I know sometimes a director doesn't, a producer doesn't have money for a year and a half. What do you say?
I'm sorry. I know I can recommend someone who can, really good up and coming editor who'll work for less.
Right. You say the same thing, Matt?
Yeah, basically. And I've also worked on, I've also worked on films that have run out of money at the very end. And, you know, if you've invested a year plus on something, and it means you have to work, you know, for a couple months without it. But that doesn't happen anymore. So if there's any producers out here, don't get any ideas.
Yeah, this is really important too. This is some advice I got early in my career, which is always tell the truth. Like, don't say you can't. Don't say you can do something that you can't do. It's it's really a stupid thing to do. So that's why I'm honest.
Amy?
Well, I'm lucky that I can kind of go off and cut trailers and movie promos and kind of like have other things to sort of support my documentary habit. And so it's like a big heroin habit. Because sometimes I don't get paid anything on them, and sometimes the last two films we were lucky to have the producer Will Hector, who, you know, came up with the funds to pay us to be able to survive. And but there's sort of a unwritten rule of good, fast, and cheap. Yeah. And yeah, you can't have all three. So you can have
That's
two.
a good phrase. Good, fast, and cheap.
You can have two of the three.
Yeah, you can have two.
My next question is, I think, one of the most interesting questions in the editing process that I know editors struggle with and directors struggle with is the collaboration. What is the editor-director relationship? Me, I've always been one, if I'm doing a film that I've come on as the editor, I really don't want the director around me until I show a cut. But I've also, when I was a younger editor, I had directors who wanted to be around all the time. You know, so what is the director-editor relationship for you guys, Matt?
Well, again, it really does depend on the director that you're working with. With Gideon's Army, Dawn Porter is the director, and she was fabulous. And she had, I think, somewhat more of a hands-off approach, where she would let me go and work on a scene, and then eventually scenes, cuts, whatever, and then screen them for her, and then she would give me feedback, and then I'd go away, and that was sort of the way we worked. But, for example, with Marshall Curry, who directed If a Tree Falls and Racing Dreams, he's actually an editor himself and spends a great deal of time in the edit room, and we would work separately at times for, you know, a month, sort of in the same room, but not really showing things to each other. And then by the end, I think we would pretty much be working simultaneously on the very fine points of the film and everything. So it really depends, but I think at this point I prefer to be off in a room by myself for a long period of time, try to get something working, and especially because it's really good for the director and who's already so involved in the film and has seen the footage and been there, to not see what I'm doing every day and have somewhat fresh eyes on the cut by the time they come in and look at it.
Amy?
Well, I live in Atlanta, and my partner, Peter, lives in New York. He's been Ken Burns' producer for many years, and so we don't work in the same room together, but thanks to the internet, after I get a cut of a scene, like maybe about 10 minutes of a chunk, then I would send it to him over the internet and then get his comments and tweak it, and then send it out to our producer, Will Hector, and our other producer on this last film, Sharon Felder, who's Doc's daughter. And but when we were first putting the film together, after we had all the transcripts and did our selects and kind of came up with a rough script, we met in New York, all four of us, for I guess, a couple long weekends and just kind of trying to get it down from about, 5 hours worth of footage to 2.5 hours. And then I would just go away with that kind of paper cut and, make all the kind of editing image and music decisions. So.
Penny, how do you work?
It's such an, these guys clearly work with the same directors over and over again. I don't, which I think says a lot about. It's such an intense relationship. Like,
I like this word.
no, it really is. It's like, okay, very few people, you guys back me up here or not, make documentaries for money, because there is no money. They make it out of love. And most of the budget goes to the editor. So you have that, you're in this relationship with a person where they're coming to you with their dream, like, make my dream come true. I don't know if you guys, it's really intense, and it can be really, and the collaboration is, and it's their film, but when I cut a film, I get super invested, so it feels like my film. So then you have like two people fighting over a film. So you have that going into it. And I pick films at this point as much on the personality of the director and the chemistry as not, because if you're in a room with somebody and you're not getting along with them, you're screwed. Oh, I shouldn't say that.
You can say that.
I can say that?
It's on tape.
Because it is. It's a marriage. It's an intense marriage where you're both. I don't know if you guys agree or not. Maybe again, you keep working with the
Yes.
same people, so they like you. So clearly, I'm doing something.
No, I would tend to agree with you, Penny, because as a young editor, I was extremely intense, extremely emotional, and I would yell and fight and scream. Now, I've mellowed out now in my older years.
I'm trying.
But I used to really say, like you, this is my film. How can you tell me how to make it?
Yeah.
And I would always have the director say, well, Sam, you forgot who the editor is and who the director is. That would be the constant conversation. But it's always, and even with people I've worked with multiple times, I can still be that way sometimes. So it's always a different thing. I find that the collaboration with a director producer can be both frustrating and exhilarating. Sometimes at the same time.
Yeah.
Because sometimes a director or producer will force you to do things editorially, and you'll say it doesn't work, and then they'll still want to keep it that way. Then you look at the finished film and say, "Shit, I told you that shit didn't work."
Yeah.
Or else they tell you to change it, and it's like, that's the way I originally had it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Change it back.
I was at Jonathan Oppenheim. He's a wonderful editor. He did The Oath and Children Underground. And I was at his birthday party a few years ago, and I looked around, and everyone around the table were his directors that he had worked with. I thought this would never happen to me. And because it's antagonistic. You get so, I'm not that bad. Okay.
Let me ask you this question. What is it like when you come in on a project? You mentioned this, Matt, that's already been in process and been working. Sometimes directors have been editing their own stuff and they get to a point where they hit a wall and they say, I need some fresh eyes. What is it like when you come in on a project that's been going for a while, or you replace another editor?
Actually, the film that I just most recently worked on is this exact thing happened. It's about a rock band called The National, and they had been working on a film for the last 2 years, and they had a pretty decent cut of the movie that they'd had multiple people working on, and I basically came in and we really just started to work together. I mean, they were very open. It depends on how. It actually depends on how much they've come up against the wall and how much they are struggling for how to do, how to make something work. If they know it's not working, it's a wonderful process because you can come in and you can say, here are the different things that you need to do, and they're very open to them because they've been really struggling to make the film. But it's sometimes hard because directors, and understandably so, in the same way that we start to think everything is really precious after a while. We'll just think like, oh no, you can't possibly change that little thing. I'm not kidding. People will come down to a word or a phrase or whether or not somebody says and or but, and they can't possibly imagine it being any different way than they've seen it 300 times because it's the same way you listen to songs over and over and over again, and it has to be that way, and they just get caught up in it. And that's a lot of what editors do. Is sort of psychologically convince people to do things that they're not very comfortable doing. And that's a lot of. I think a lot of it is just sort of sitting there and just sort of saying like, well, let's just try this and see how this works, and dealing with producers and directors, and I'm sure they feel the exact same way about us, and you know, they feel like it's a big psychological game to try to convince us to, you know, do what we need to do. So,
Amy, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I've never actually come in on a film in progress, but I have consulted on films before, and I've run into that same thing where somebody's so married to something, especially if it's something involving them personally, and it's just not working. But I was thinking about Sam and I, we worked on, I edited a film called Going to Chicago, and Sam was our story consultant. And there was, you know, he went through all the footage, and I cut together one scene, I remember, and showed it to him, and he said, wow, I never thought you could get a scene out of that. That is fantastic. And I was just like, patting myself on the back, and he's like, okay, now you have to take it out. Which is what we call killing our babies. Yeah. It's like, oh, but he was right. He was absolutely right. It didn't serve the story, but you get attached to these things, and as an editor or as a director.
Let me ask you all this question. I know Amy and I both started in film. I don't know if you started in film, Penny or Matt. I mean, editing on film.
Oh, on like a flatbed.
Yeah. Did you edit on flatbed?
In college.
In college.
In college.
Yeah.
I still have mine.
Yeah, I know. and there's always been, for us older editors, I'm not sure I'm in that category anymore, but there's always been this feeling that editing on film, you were able to really consider the cuts, as opposed to, okay, wait, let me finish. Where nowadays on the nonlinear technology, you can just try and try and try and try and try. So what do you think of that?
No, I'm sorry. You old timers, not that you're an old timer, but I have like editor friends who are a little older than me, not much, who talk about the rhythm of the steam back and the lung, and you have the film and you touch it and you feel it. If anyone has worked with a steam back, like, it's a pain in the ass. You have little things, you lose it. I think that's bogus. I mean, non-linear computer editing is awesome, and I would not be an editor without it, because you can try different things really quickly. Back me up here.
Yeah, I feel like bad things are going to happen if I disagree, but yeah, I did it in college. I actually don't think I would have been an editor if I had to cut on a steam back, and the reason is I just don't have the small hand coordination to be able to splice things and tape them together. I mean, I would just film would have just been falling apart on me constantly, and I wouldn't know how to do. But I do think there's some truth to making a decision was completely different before, because if you guys don't know, I mean, it would be, you would have these spools of film, and you'd have to load them onto the steam back, get them up, make a slice with a blade, take tape or glue in sometimes, and press them together and make sure the sprocket holes didn't get, and I don't know if assistant editors were the people that would make those, do the taping or whatnot.
The editor did it. Okay,
yeah, and can you imagine, all we have to do is hit a keyboard command, and that entire process takes place in a fraction of a second. And so I think that the decision-making process was much tougher, and you really had to think about what you were doing beforehand. But I'm trying to imagine, I spend so much time adding a frame, watching it, taking that frame off, and I'm just trying to imagine a frame would be like this. So try to imagine taking something that's that small and putting it on, taking it off, and then by the time you've done it, the tape is not really glued anymore, and it's just I can't imagine how difficult that must have been. I really don't think I would have been an editor if I had to do that. Yeah.
Go ahead, Amy. Defend it now.
Okay. Well, I started out on upright cutters, so yeah, which is like farm equipment basically, and a lot of those editors have kind of lost part of their hearing really from working on it. But so a flatbed to me was a luxury, and you're right about, considering your cut. You really almost have to edit a scene in your head, because if you chop up your work print too much, it's not going to run smoothly when you try and project it. It's going to get all mangled. But the great thing about, I was one of the first editors in Atlanta to work on Avid, and I completely skipped over videotape editing. And I thought if I had to do that, I felt the same way. It's like I would go paint houses or something, because there's just no way that I would want to do the video editing, color correct, and it would make you sloppy because it's such a pain to try and change and edit a couple frames that you would just go, oh, you know, it's okay. So I love the Avid. I've stayed with the Avid the whole time, and I do love the fact that I can look at a dissolve and I don't have to send it away to a lab for a couple days, wait for it to come back and hope it looks okay. You know, I can just, you know, those are the kind of things that I really appreciate about it.
Well, I'm going to jump in this, and I'm going to say that after editing on the Steam Vec for over 20 years, I don't miss it at all. You know, and I never liked the idea of looking for 2 or 3 or 4 frames. And the thing I love about the nonlinear technology, the Avid, Final Cut, and now I hear Premiere is coming out, is that it gives me the ability to feel like I can cut a sequence one way and then recut it another way and see how I feel about the differences. I find that fantastic. I've always found that fantastic, you know. So I think the nonlinear technology is great. My next question is, after all of you guys get to a picture lock, or even maybe before, in your case of the Doc Pomus film, how do you work with music when you're editing? Some people talk about, some editors say that when they do a montage, they like to have the music, or they like to have some sense of the music to create a montage. Some don't. I mean, I prefer nowadays to cut a montage without any music, you know, because I want to be able to sort of understand that it's the images that I'm more concerned about. Because sometimes when I used to edit with music, the music would become the forefront, and the pictures would recede. So I would just be hearing the music and not really looking at the cuts. How do you guys like to work with music? And a composer, if you have a composer.
Yeah, I on Gideon's Army, we really didn't have a lot of music in the film, and up until probably 2 months before we picture locked. And I actually think that's the better way to work, because I think that sometimes music can be a crutch. A scene works a lot better when it has a score underneath it, no matter what state it's in. And so I try to do without. Now, as far as montages, I actually love working with music in montages, and I know that the song is in all likelihood is going to be replaced, but just the rhythm of the song, I like to have something to cut along to. Now, as far as working with a composer, we worked with this great guy, Paul Brill. Yeah, he did Gideon, and he's great. I mean, he's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and what I had done beforehand was I actually went to there's a Sundance lab for editors, and I went there this past summer, and I was working with a great editor there named Louis Erskine, who's fantastic, and he basically, we sat down one day and just started to try to find different songs that might work within the film, just to give Paul some sense of the tone of what we were trying to go for. And we would just sort of lay things in, and that was sort of the process that we went in. And so I try to have some kind of music in there, always to give the composer a sense of what we're going for, yeah.
It's about control for me. Like, I'd use temp music. I use temp tracks because I want it controls. I mean, you're absolutely right. If I'm wall-to-wall music, having wall-to-wall music means the film is sucking. But I do need music, and I do like putting the music in. So it lets. Often the composer comes in after I'm gone, and I want it to sound and feel like what I put into the film. Because to me, that's one of the elements of telling the story.
But what happens when you use a temp track and you fall in love with the temp track, and then all of a sudden the composer comes in and creates something that instrumentally and musically sounds different? How do you react to that?
It hurts.
But it's also really, I've learned over time that it's really good to try to find temp music that isn't, like, you don't want to try to, docs have no budget. So they're not going to have a budget to rescore a 30-piece orchestra. That's never going to happen. So what I try to do is go out and find temp music that feels like it could be recreated with one composer who maybe calls in a couple friends that can play different instruments and recreate the song. So because you really do fall in love with it, and then the scene feels different. And then the thing is, that only happens for the first month or so. And then now when I go and I saw Gideon in the theater here just a couple days ago, I couldn't even remember the song that used to be there.
You can. It's really funny because we all share the same music, and we all tend to take soundtracks from like Beasts of the Southern Wild and Explosions in the Sky. Right. You totally used Explosions in the Sky, didn't you?
We got it though.
Oh, you did get it. Okay.
No, we did get it. Yeah, we did end up getting it. Yeah.
No, it's funny though because because I use that piece in many films I've cut. So we all use the same. I don't know if you do the same.
Well, I'm real involved in the music every step of the way. I wanted to be a music editor instead of just a picture editor. And I studied music in college. And so I've worked with composers, and I've also had just things scored with, just recording historical pieces of music, at various tempos and, just kind of Ken Burns style.
Yeah.
And then, using songs too, like Johnny Mercer was also built around the songs, and Doc Pomus had fantastic music to work with. But I love putting together the temp track. It's one of my favorite parts because I guess I'm a frustrated musician. And so, like you're saying, I've never used John Williams or anything, unreachable. But sometimes what I'll do is get music from the composer that we intend on using and, just, work with it to kind of get an idea and then say, something like what you did here, but a little darker, and it gets close to, what you're using. On Jews in Baseball, I used Randy Newman and Thomas Newman's scores. It was just like the perfect thing for that. And I had met Randy Newman's orchestrator at one of Randy's recording sessions, and he gave me his card and said, if you ever need any music. And so I said, who better to knock off Randy Newman than Michael Roth? So, and he did a fantastic score, and it was our first documentary that was kind of scored to picture.
What about working now with visual effects? We all know that visual effects are used a lot now in documentaries. And how do you work with people who are creating visual effects? Do you get very involved in the conception and construction of visual effects? What's your process?
What I basically do is we try to make sure. Let's say, I'll give you an example. In the film that I'm working on right now, we want to introduce the band that the movie is about, and we want to be able to tell people that you want to get a couple facts across, that they're a big band, that they're playing for a certain amount of people. There was a New York Times article about them, and we had to also include the fact that it was a band consisting of different sets of brothers, right? So we needed a chunk of basically a graphics, and this is sort of what we're talking about. And we had a graphics designer, and we just had to make sure basically that there was enough time to do the graphics. And once we knew that, we just put a slug in that said graphics to come, and we just kept going with the rest of the film. And then eventually we hired somebody to come in, and we would meet with them and say, okay, this is the first thing we want it to be, and this is the second thing. But most of the time, I mean, the reason you hire really good people also is because they take your suggestions and then they make it much better. So that happens a lot. But you try to be very involved because it's just, it's content. It's really, most of the time when you're using graphics and documentaries, you're trying to get something across in a much cleaner way than you would by just editing picture. So that's how.
Penny?
No, I totally agree. Like I am a graphics idiot. I can't do graphics. It's a different skill set. I don't actually know any doc editors who do their own graphics especially because now it's so high end. But it is content, and Matt's totally right. Like in the beginning of the Joan Rivers film, there's like a 30-second. We have to give her history in 30 seconds, and you have to do that graphically. And I picked the elements, and then we sent it off. So it's exactly what he's saying.
What about you, Amy?
I map it out on the Avid, and ours are usually pretty simple. I don't like to see a lot of, photographs that, now everybody has After Effects, and they can do all these, like make them 3D, and it's like, put a fire behind their head or whatever, and so I just like to keep it simple, and the stuff I do on the Avid looks really crappy, and then I hand it off to Brian, our graphics guy, and he makes it look beautiful in HD, and so.
And my final question before I see if there's any questions from the audience is, nowadays I've had the tendency that when I've worked on some films that they don't have enough money in the budget to have me come to the mix, even though I may sort of supervise the sound effects. And sometimes I don't go to the mix, but sometimes I do. What's your situation now in terms of when you're doing the finishing, in terms of sound work and sound effects, the mix?
Same thing. People are out of money. If I like the director, I'll come to the mix, and if I don't, I won't.
I've been very fortunate in this regard. On Gideon, we mixed at Skywalker, which is out in California, north of San Francisco, and Dawn and Julie, the producer, they had money in the budget to be able to send me out to Skywalker for 2 weeks for the sound edit, which is basically an example would be if we were filming somebody in the back of the room and that door closed, but the microphone wasn't able to pick it up, you'll put like the sound of the door closing, things like that go into the film, and also just making all of the little dialogue edits that you've done sound smoother, things along that line. And then the next week, Dawn and Julie flew out and worked on the mix with me. So I personally feel that being there for the sound edit is extremely important for the editor to be there for. Yeah, I think you really can add something to the narrative of the film if you're there for the sound development. So I think it's really important. I always tell people that. So.
Amy?
I can't imagine not being at the sound mix. I've mixed a couple films at Skywalker, and that's kind of like filmmaking nirvana. And you go in there did you screen in the Stag Theater? Yeah, and you just know it's never going to sound this good again. So really listen to it real good. But and they bring anybody that isn't working on anything, they bring in as your audience, and I mean it's just wonderful. But that's the top end, but I'm kind of a control freak about the mix and the sound, and even on dramatic features, I just think there's just so much that can be helped with sound, and so I'm there for every second.
Good answers from the panel here. Is there questions? There's a hand.
So you think music in Ken Burns' films kind of takes you out of the drama?
I don't like it. It overwhelms me, and it's too much.
Yeah, well, I guess that's just his style, and obviously, a lot of people think he's doing something right, but I know what you mean. You keep hearing a theme over and over again, and
you want to weigh in on this one, Matt?
No, I'm okay.
Say, question, hand up the back.
Can you talk a little bit about the tension between truth in documentary and story?
That's a good question. Really,
Here we go.
The tension between truth and story. Who wants to pick up on that one?
I'm just going to say I think there's the spirit of truth, which we all as editors must be true to, but life doesn't happen in a narrative, in a narrative. It doesn't happen cleanly, and there's a constant struggle on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. You could have a whole panel based on that. But of course, you're going to have to change things in chronology to tell a story, to have clarity. And I have no problem doing that as long as I'm true to what I think the spirit of the truth is, which is, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of it. Most recently, I think a really good example is what I try not to do is, I don't know if you guys heard the story of how Bob Woodward completely misrepresented what the White House economic aide had said to him, and said that he had sort of threatened him when in fact he was still reporting a sentence that the person had said, but it was completely taken out of context and was not at all what the person meant. It was not meant as a threat at all. And I always think, like, journalistically, you want to stay as much as you can in the truth, like you said, of what really sort of happened. But I mean, that's what we do. I mean, that's when you hire an editor, when you look for a great editor to work on your film, you're hiring us to make a story out of 500 hours of real life. And so, I mean, that's what I love doing when I edit. I mean, I look forward to that more than anything else, is sort of, we are making docs, but we are following the same arcs and that you see in narrative filmmaking, and that's what makes our jobs amazing. I mean, especially with cutting vérité, you get this opportunity to just shape, characters, and you just don't want to do what I said, like with the Bob Woodward thing, where you just take it that level where you're completely misrepresenting what a person said or what happened in real life. And I think that as long as you don't do that, I think you're in good shape.
Amy?
Well, on our film that's screening this afternoon, A.K.A. Doc Pomus, I worked really closely with Doc's daughter, Sharon, and so, when it's a family member that's involved in the creative process, it's kind of tricky, but she trusted us, and I really tried to kind of preserve the dignity of people and not be manipulative, but also just try and find the drama in the situations. So.
I would weigh in, and I sort of echo what Matt and Penny is saying, probably more so than what you're saying, Amy. I believe we're storytellers, and part of our job is to tell a story as dramatically as possible, if you can. And if I have to alter, and adjust what I call the truth, and I find that word truth a funny word, I find it a very funny word, because we basically, our job is to make something so engaging and manipulate you and pull you in that you say, oh, wow, what a great story, and you don't be thinking about, well, is that unless you're so invested in, as a viewer, you're so invested in the subject, you know more than what the filmmaker has done. So I believe I'm a storyteller, and if I'm looking at an interview and I'm selecting an interview and I know I have to compress it and sharpen it, that's what I'll do. If I have to take take a word that he didn't say and put it into replace, and put it into his sentence, I will do that. I will do that. That's my job, so that when you listen to it, you say, oh, I want you to be paying attention to me, And I personally would have a problem with a relative being involved with the film that I was doing about their parent or their mother or their father, because it's gonna make me nervous, because even they have their own version of how they see their family member. Everybody sees people differently. So that's what's always fascinating about the documentary process. It's what I call the Rashomon effect. So to me, it's a very kind of very sort of sticky kind of approach to when you're making documentaries. But it's one of the reasons, like Matt, I love the process. I love the process of, if I say I'm going to make John Coltrane iconic, that's my job. If I say I want to make him look like an asshole, I'll do it, but maybe not as far as I should do it. I want the people to be complicated when I'm making a documentary. I don't want you to be just one way. I don't want you to be a person who's like just wonderful. I want you to be complicated, and that's probably, to me, is the biggest. That's one of the reasons I love that Joan Rivers doc so much, because I was saying to Penny last night, to me she's tragic, but she's also funny, and she's also intimidating. She's also frustrating. This lady she's a fantastic human being, but complicated. That's what you're supposed to be looking for when you watch a film. I'm enough. Sir.
I'd like to hear how you handle long-distance relationships, in the sense that I'm about to start a project that will take at least the next year and a half with an editor who lives 1,000 miles from me. And yeah, you'll probably think that it's heaven in a way. but when, I guess it's how to structure. Obviously, we can get together at certain key times. I won't be able to watch the footage with him when he watches it originally. When, at what stages, and for how long, ideally, would you want the director in the same room with you?
I did a project where the directors lived in Sun Valley, Idaho, and I was in New York City. No problem. You have technology. You have Skyping. You can do Final Cut has a system where they can watch the cut and you can watch them. It's no problem whatsoever. I don't think it's an issue at this point. I mean, it is different being in person. I know that, but.
Yeah, so how often would you want that person with him?
I'm not the one. Never. So you.
I actually just think, like, really the key to that is, and it sounds like an actual long distance relationship, but like you just like communication and just like really like, no, but seriously, because I've done it where I have a tendency to do the thing where I go away and I just work on a project and I forget that I have to like say like, well, these are the things that I'm working on, and just keeping the person up to date, and then all of a sudden they see a cut and they're just like, wow, I didn't know you were doing these things, and so it can go really well, or or they can be like, I had no idea this is the direction that the film was going to be going in. And so I think it's really important to just always to tell your editor to say like, just check in with me every once in a while and to let me know where you're going, and you can, I mean, the technology is there where you can have drives and a system, and they can send you the sequences that they're working on a weekly, daily, even basis, and just sort of say like, here, look, this is what I'm doing, and keeping you up to date and everything. So it's the technology's there.
Amy, you do it all the time, right?
Yeah, I do. I'm getting ready to start a project with producers in Germany, so I've just learned about Skyping, but I'm used to sending links by you send it. I'll cut about a 10-minute sequence, or like get to a good stopping point, And then, but I like to be in the room at the very beginning when we're kind of trying to do a paper cut, and then towards the end when we're trying to lock the picture, then we can really get in there and tweak it together. So everything else can be done remotely.
Miss?
I'd love to hear you talk about narration. Do you use the old-fashioned, or does it have a place in certain kind of film? Does it save time? How do you think about whether or not a film should have narration or not? And if I can ask not somewhat related, how do you decide if a film should be theatrical or
I find that all documentary producers think their films are theatrical. And I think it's a big mistake, because not every documentary should be a theatrical release, in my opinion. That's how I feel about that theatrical question. In terms of, what was the first part of your question? Well, to me, if it's a subject that has, you know, I think a tremendous amount of impact that will really engage a large audience, then it should be a theatrical. You know, I mean, I think a film like The Gatekeepers, that's a theatrical film for me. You know, I think there's certain films that have a feeling that a lot of mass people want to see it. Sometimes certain small films that people are so personal about, that they've invested so much time in, it's important that they make it, but I'm not sure that it needs to be seen by a lot of people, because reality is theatrical doesn't really mean a lot in terms of finances. Most documentaries don't make money. They don't make money. It's really like an ego thing to me for people to say my film should be a theatrical. You know, for me, in my opinion. You know. Oh, narration, I hate narration. But I understand too from my years of editing that there are certain films that I'm forced to put narration in. So if I'm doing a documentary for American Masters, when I did the John Ford, John Wayne documentary that I directed for American Masters, I knew I had to put narration in, so I got Sidney Pollack to do the narration. But when I do the documentaries for Spike, When the Levees Broke, For Little Girls, we always say at the very beginning, no narration, the people will tell a story. Because narration is always that voice of God thing. I mean, for me, most times, you know, so I don't really like it, but if I have to, I will use it. I don't know how everyone else feels.
Yep, same.
But did you know Hoop Dreams had narration? That blew me away. Hoop Dreams has narration, and it's so good and so well done. I didn't even remember that. Crazy, right? I had a bet, and I lost it.
I usually don't use narration. I try and get the interviews, you know, well cut enough to be able to tell the story cohesively. But on our last film, Jews in Baseball, it was just such an epic story, and there was just no way to tell that through the interviews. So we got Dustin Hoffman to do the narration, and he at first didn't want to do it because he doesn't do narration. If you look at IMDb, he's, you know, just he's a method actor, and if he stumbles, that's part of his character. And so we worked with him for 2 days, and he kept saying, "You're going to be up all night," you know, and he was right. It took me so much surgery to you know, make it work, and speeding up certain parts of the sentence, and there's thousands of edits in his narration, but it worked great on the film. And some of our other films, we haven't had official narrators, but there's almost like unofficial narrators. And in Doc Pomus, we used Doc's journals to kind of help us give a storyline, and Lou Reed read those for him because he was really close friends with Doc. So.
Matt, what do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add. I just think the only film I've ever worked on that has narration is a film called If a Tree Falls, and is the one about the environmental extremists. And when Marshall and I started working on the movie, we swore up and down that there would never be narration in it, and then it just became obvious over the course of the film that it had to, and it really worked in this case because the person that we were following was actually friends with Marshall prior to the filmmaking process, so he actually had a reason for being a voice in the film. But typically, I'll avoid it like the plague. So yeah.
I was going to say, often though, like if the subject is still alive, I'll go back after the edit and ask them questions, and so it's being used as narration, though like it feels like an interview. I think we've all probably done that.
Yeah, we've all done that. And I would sum up by saying that there's only one film that I really think, if the narration is personal,
Yeah.
really personal, I like it. I mean, there's this feature film that I love the assassination of Jesse James by that coward Robert Ford, at the beginning, whoever wrote this narration and being so descriptive about Jesse James, it was phenomenal to me. And it was like personal. It gave me like insight into him on a personal level. That to me is good narration. Any other questions, sir?
So when you're dealing with, you say you don't like to deal with sentiment, the relative of subject.
Not really.
And I don't really blame you, but if you're dealing with somebody who, say, died 50 years ago, or 75 years ago, and there are descendants, first of all, what role then would descendants have played earlier in the film in making the film? In shooting the original footage or doing the research for the film, and what if you or the director has a position on the subject that is different from the how do you deal with that, if at all? And if you have to deal with it at all, do you have to deal with it at all? Do you even have to deal with the descendants? Period.
Well, you know, I think we all as editors feel very proprietary, so we just don't think of ourselves as just sitting as editors. We deal with everything. And to answer your question, when I edited this documentary for HBO about Gordon Parks about 15 years ago, he was alive, right? And he had a lot to say about what he wanted to see in the film. You know, we didn't always think it was good, but he had a lot of power, you know. And so we really paid attention to him because he was the real engine for that film, you know. But when you deal with people who've been dead a long time, to me, the thing about Descendants is, I'll say it better. I'll phrase it this way. I'm getting ready to direct a documentary about August Wilson, so I have to deal with his wife, who's his widow, you know. And at some point, I'm going to interview her. At some point, I'm going to go to their storage facility and shoot stuff there, you know. But I also have to be mindful that I can't make Costanza's documentary. I got to make my documentary. Now, I may put some things in there that she may not be crazy about, but contractually, it's already in the contract that American Masters and QED and Sam Park, we have the final cut. You know, you got to do that. You got to protect yourself, because then you become hostage to a descendant or to a family member. You can't be hostage. You got to make your film. Yeah.
Well, I've done a lot of work with descendants too, but I was really lucky to be working with Doc's daughter on this film, because she had started to make a film about her father about 7 years ago. So she'd already gathered all these photos and home movies and just like tons of material to work with. And so, you know, she was the only one who knew him and who was there. And so I felt like she kind of kept us honest about who he was. But at the same time, there were moments that I really had to fight for the drama. You know, if her mother cries and stuff, and you know, she just really did not want that in the film. But you know, you read the reviews now, and that's like something that is one of the most heartfelt things that people remember. And so, you know, you have to look for the drama, like you were saying.
2 more questions. Anyone else, sir? Great question, man. A great question.
I take films based on, as I said, the personality of the director, but more important, I want a new challenge every time. So I don't have a style. And actually, after I did the Joan Rivers film, because it was popular, I got a lot of calls to do other similar like films, and I wouldn't go near them. Because for me, like what's fun about the job is I get to do different things, different styles, and learn about different subjects. So I actually don't do that.
I mean, I've made the mistake before to run after films that have great subject matter, and I think I do what you mentioned now, which is really trying to find somebody that you want to collaborate with for a year and a half. As far as sort of style of filmmaking, I think what I always love to do is to find a way to put the subject matter almost on the back burner and focus on as much as possible, bring out like the human story of what the different characters are kind of going through. That's what I always, and make it, and just sort of like we've talked about before, just like always focus on the story and the narrative, and just sort of making it as universal as possible, sort of like what each character is going through, less than if you're working on a film about the criminal justice system or something like that, to try to, because that's going to be there no matter what, and to try to focus on the other part of it.
I think working on historical documentaries, I have more freedom than if it was vérité to kind of, I guess, work with music and pace it. And so I try and look at it on an emotional level and kind of juxtapose humor and drama. And I feel like, when you get them close together, it kind of accentuates each. And then I also try and kind of give it a musical sense and a flow, so the transitions are real, easy when they need to be, or in your face when they're not.
I would say I don't have a style. I'm sort of like Penny. I like different challenges, and sometimes I'll fall flat on my face, and sometimes I'll soar. But I like the idea of trying different ways to approach a film, and to me that's because if I don't want to feel like I can dictate to a director, even though I can be pretty intense. I don't want to dictate to a director how their film should be the way I want to see it, because it's not my film. That's why I became a producer, because I said, well, I got to make my own films if I want it to be the way I want it to be. But when I'm editing, I want to be able to say, okay, this is a Spike Lee joint. I mean, I never think those films are my films, really, at the end of the day. If I'm editing like this film today, Remote Area Medical, it's Jeff Reichen and Faria's film. To me, I want to adjust and be open to different ways to put a film together. One more question, Miss, you had your hand up?
Can you please talk about the initial stages of the vérité film? There are all these hours. Are you watching them all? Do you know?
Were you not here at the beginning, Christy?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. She's a friend. I'm not. I know her. I'm not.
One more question. Yes, in the back.
So you guys all talked about how when you're cutting a film, you guys have a lot of disagreements with the directors about what should stay, what should go at times. Can you guys each give an example from a movie you've worked on that still haunts you about the baby you had to kill, and why you think that still should have been in the film?
To be perfectly honest, I don't have those. I think that the interesting thing is that you get notes from people, and at the time you're sitting there and you're just like, I cannot believe that they want me to take this out, or it's just like, they're such idiots. Like, how could they possibly think this? And then over time you're like, I think honestly that was probably for the best. I mean, if something is really good, if it truly works, you'll battle and you'll scream, and eventually it'll either stay in or it won't. But I don't have a lot of things that I think absolutely should have been in there after all this time. So that's I mean, I'm sure everybody has a different experience, but I don't.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, you move on,
Yeah.
I've only had one experience like that, and that was on the Johnny Mercer film, because the director, Bruce Ricker, he just kind of threw out the entire script that somebody really knowledgeable had written, and it was a great script, and came back with a Post-it note with 5 songs on it and said, "This is the film. This is what we're going to make." And he couldn't even read one of the song titles. And so that whole film is kind of stillborn to me. It was it was probably the most depressing. It could have been it was still nominated for an Emmy, but it didn't really tell the story. And he had such a dramatic and amazing life, and it's just kind of I don't know.
I was
sad.
I would just sum up and say that I try not to hold on to too many things. I mean, sometimes, quite honestly, it's the little things to me that will irritate me when I see a film. Like, tomorrow when they show that damn Venus and Serena film, these directors made me put too many fade to blacks. That's the little things.
that drives me nuts.
That drives me nuts. I mean, because to me, I said, what the fuck did I put that fade to black? But normally I don't. If there was a sequence that I had cut that was taken out, I usually forget about it. I mean, I can't hold on to it because it'll just deplete me psychologically and emotionally. I want to thank you all. I want to thank this great panel, Penny, Matt, Amy. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.